Hi, my name is Josh Goldberg, and I generally prefer inferring return types. As I wrote in my book, Learning TypeScript, buy it now! It is generally best to let TypeScript infer types whenever possible. Doing so saves you having to type things out and update them as you change your code, and it allows TypeScript to infer types that are often better than what you would have instinctively written. So by writing your own type, you might just be making your code worse. The only time when you absolutely must write out a return type is for recursive functions when you want to avoid implicit any's. TypeScript won't attempt to figure them out on its own, it'll just bail out and give up unless you add an explicit return type annotation on the function that is recursive. That being said, there are a few cases where explicitly writing out function return types can be useful. Most commonly, you might want a more specific type than what TypeScript would infer by default. For example, you might want to return a union of string literals rather than the general string primitive. Or you might want a tuple rather than a variable length array. Tuples in particular are pretty common with hooks in modern UI frameworks like React, Preact, and so on, and Solid. Another one is if the shape of the object returned by a function is reused or referenced many times, even if you don't explicitly need to have a name for it, it can be useful. You might want to create an interface or object type alias with a name that can then be used in other type annotations, which would additionally allow you to use nice IDE features on it like rename, find all references, go to definition, and so on. In large functions that have a lot of return statements, it can be nice also to have an explicit return type annotation on the function to make sure that they all return the same thing as you write the function. Now, in general, I try to avoid really big functions. That's kind of a code smell, but sometimes you can't, avoid it. It has to happen. Lastly, and this one should not affect the vast majority of people, if you have very many fancy dynamic types across very many files, it can be useful for TypeScript type checking performance to have explicit return types. This almost certainly will not be an issue for you unless you have very many hundreds of files across very many hundreds of changes, but sometimes it does happen. I will also note that if type checking performance is a problem for you, this is probably not the first thing you should try to fix it. The first thing would probably be to make sure that your type checking is not part of your build, that it's moved to a separate process run in CI. I would also suggest trying to see if you have any really ridiculous uses of the type system, like conditional mapped logical types, and then try to simplify or remove those. Now, if you do have a lot of files and you do find that explicit function return types is a benefit for you, then I would recommend trying out the TypeScript ESLint lint rule, explicit module boundary types. It makes sure that your functions that are exported from files have explicit argument and return types, which can be useful both for the performance and for the documentation aspects. Cheers.